Hello, Molweni rather, Sanu Hujambo. This is Unwrap Africa. I'm Liesl Wilson. Of course, I'm standing in for my colleague, Tebigile Mkhototo. Let's take a look at some of those stories, of course, making headlines and news on the African continent, the latest trends, news, and success stories. Let's take a look. Coming up on the show, we're actually speaking to political analyst Dr Nicole Beardsworth. This is about Zambia's upcoming general elections, and perhaps also as we shine a spotlight on Uganda, we look at government's efforts, how they are stepping up their emergency funding as a prolonged dry spell threatens crops. Lots in store. Let's also take a look at that question of the day. So we welcome your thoughts. Zambia preparing for general elections come August. All eyes are on incumbent Hakainde Hichilema. Of course, we're asking, can he retain power after the recent government fallout over former President Edgar Lungu's burial? Now, you can weigh in using our various social media platforms. Of course, on Facebook, we are at SABC Unwrap Africa, and on X at SABC News_TV is our handle. Well, let's get straight into that Continental wrap.
Nous sommes abandonnés à notre triste sort. On trouve que dans ces CTI ici, il y a le taux élevé même de guérison.
The Democratic Republic of Congo, health workers at Bunia's Elikia Ebola Treatment Center, they're protesting over 2 months of unpaid wages. The protest comes just 2 days after Prime Minister Judith Tuluka visited Ituri and admitted to supply shortages whilst promising better support for frontline staff. Thousands of cancer patients in Sudan are unable to afford essential medicine and medication to support chemotherapy as a result of the country's civil war. Doctors say frequent power cuts are also affecting cancer treatment and comes as hospitals struggle to keep life-saving machines running. Officials in Mali say security threats are growing more advanced as preparations begin for the second Bamako International Defence and Security Exhibition come November. They've warned that armed groups are now using what they termed armed economic and information terrorism against Mali and its alliance of the Sahel states partners. And US President Donald Trump has commended Nigerian President Bola Tinubu for his response to violence in the country. The note marks a shift from Trump's criticism last year over the treatment of Christians in Nigeria. All right, those are your headlines. Perhaps as we also delve in further, one of the big stories we are following is Zambia gearing up for next month's general election in which 14 candidates there vying for the country's top position. However, President Hakainde Hichilema, of course, favored to win a second term, but may face a strong challenge from opposition leader Brian Mundubile. Of course, some analysts also saying that Zambia's economy has remained stable, with key sectors continuing to operate smoothly despite heightened political activity. So to chat now a little bit more about this, we're joined virtually by political analyst Dr Nicole Beardsworth. A very good evening, Dr Nicole, and thank you for your time. There's lots happening, and we're obviously trying to make sense of the dynamics. So perhaps you can now paint this picture. President Hakainde Hichilema, of course, swept into office in 2021. He promised to revive the economy, tackle corruption, restore investor confidence as well. So as we assess the gap between the reality, the economic indicators, and what's happening on the ground, has he done enough to consolidate his position?
Well, it's been an interesting couple of years, I must say. He's done remarkably well in the economy in terms of renegotiating Zambia's enormous debt, which of course was accrued under the last administration. He came in 2021 with nearly 1 million vote margin, which is the largest margin we've ever seen in Zambian history since about 1996. So since the return of multi-party democracy, this was the largest winning margin we've seen. Zambia had gone from an inflation rate in 2021 of about 25%. And this year in June, inflation was down to 6.5%. So in terms of macroeconomic indicators, the government has performed pretty impressively and has done quite a good job. But the big question ahead of this election is whether or not people feel that in their pockets, whether or not household economics is going to match national economics.
It always boils down to the bread and butter issues. So even if we look at what is truly at stake in this election, not just for Zambia, but for the broader region. How would you weigh in on that?
Absolutely. So what we've seen in neighboring Zimbabwe, neighboring Tanzania, is issues of deepening authoritarianism. We saw the post-electoral violence in Tanzania, which killed, we think, as many as 2,000 people. In Zimbabwe, we recently saw the president sign into law the Constitutional Amendment Bill 3, which is extending his term and entrenching presidential dominance. So what we've seen is a kind of growing authoritarianism and a growing acceptance of authoritarianism across the region. Similarly, issues in Mozambique around their 2024 elections. So a lot is at stake. Zambia is a kind of democratic icon and has been across the continent since 1991. They've had 3 turnovers of power, which were overall peaceful, which puts them in a very elite category of only about 5 countries on the continent that have had that. So Zambians really care about their democracy, and their democracy is really important to our region, especially in a context where we are seeing deepening and entrenched authoritarianism starting to grow with very little pushback from SADC or the African Union.
So as we try to make sense of those dynamics, we also take a look at what has transpired within the country itself. I mean, the disputes surrounding the burial of former President Edgar Lungu, that's dominated headlines. Also exposed deep political divisions. So I wonder at this point what, to what extent this episode has now affected him politically. Has it dented his re-election hopes somewhat? How do you assess that?
So it's an interesting question, because my suspicion would have been that it would damage him politically, because many people see his interventions as being responsible for the prolonged fight over the repatriation of the former president's remains. But some of our surveys suggest something a little bit more complicated than that. It seems that the family, President Edgar Lungu's family, is also being seen to be accountable for this. So I think it's a bit of an open question. Okay. I'm sure that amongst critics of the president, they see this as something that he is responsible for. And amongst the president's sympathizers, they're much more critical of President Lungu's family. So it's a slightly difficult one to read. And I think it's probably not quite as important as the household economics.
Okay, so that's part of the possibilities, the probabilities, arguably also playing with the imaginary crystal ball at this point. But we're closer to the elections. Some of the other dynamics. Brian Mundubile mounting a serious challenge. How do you weigh in on that opposition leader emerging as the main challenger, the sense you're getting on the ground? Given his campaign, what is he speaking to? Perhaps unseating Hichilema?
So what's interesting about Brian Mundubile is he was formerly of the Patriotic Front. He was a key minister in the former president's, in his cabinet. And so he is in some ways seen as a PF member, as part of the former regime, and we expect that that would kind of cut both ways. The former regime was very unpopular by the time it left power. But what he has done very successfully is that even though he's not running on a PF ticket, he has galvanized former members of the former ruling party. And so those people are running his campaign very effectively as a kind of machine in the places where the PF was very popular in the past. So he's running an impressive campaign. I've not seen a party and a candidate come from nowhere to run quite such successful rallies before in the past. Of course, HH, before he came to power, he was in opposition for 15 years, so he was very well known. Brian Mundubile doesn't have the same name recognition and doesn't have a party brand that existed prior to this election. So what's interesting about this election is there's not a single former ruling party on the ballot. This is the first time we've seen this happen since 1996, and it's quite remarkable. Mundubile would put it down to the ruling party shaping the electoral environment in their favor. The ruling party would say that it was the PF's internecine fighting that shaped it this way. But either way, I think what we're seeing is a really impressive campaign. In terms of what they stand for, Mundubile is trying to attack on HH's weak points, which is essentially the cost of living and people who are unhappy with the kind of decrease in patronage politics, which had become a key source of the sort of informal economy, especially around election time. So Mundubile is promising things to people in the informal economy. He's promising to bring back jobs, and he's promising to improve household economics, which, as I said, is probably the key issue that's going to animate this election.
Yeah, well, there are 14 candidates vying for that come election next month. But let's just quickly wrap up, looking beyond election day, regardless of who wins, the biggest challenge that awaits Zambia's next president. Also, just when to your earlier point about the message this election sends about the health, about democracy, democratic succession in Southern Africa, we're seeing the trends, the complex political, economic pressures that's also playing out. How would you assess that?
Well, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch. What we are seeing is we're living in a moment of major flux. We are expecting to have a kind of Godzilla El Nino this upcoming summer. It's going to be a difficult ride for a lot of governments, and I think a lot of governments are going to feel some pressure to clamp down on dissent rather than to adjust in ways that are very fiscally difficult in the current environment. We're seeing the clamping down of aid from donor countries from the north. So a massive reduction in aid, a massive reduction in lending, and so sort of much constrained fiscal environment for governments in a context where they're likely to face some headwinds, especially in terms of climate change and kind of agricultural production. So I think this is going to be a very important election, and I think whoever wins this election come the 13th of August is going to face some challenges regardless.
Well, Dr. Nicole, let the chess moves ensue. Thank you for your time. We'll leave our conversation there. Dr. Nicole Beardsworth, political analyst, really weighing in ahead of the general elections happening in Zambia next month. So obviously, just recapping that question of the day, shining a spotlight on Zambia as they prepare for the general elections come August. All eyes, of course, are incumbent Hakainde Hichilema. And we're asking you, can he retain power after the recent government fallout over former President Edgar Lungu's burial? Let's take a look at some of the comments you weighed in on our various social media platforms. Now, Felix says, with due respect, the late president is not the one holding our voters' cards. We will give His Excellency, the President of Zambia, another term in office. Besides, the late ECL issue is now a private matter. It's a family issue, as per their wish. Felix, thank you for weighing in. Let's take a look at more comments. Peter's also saying, commenting on behalf of all Zambians, HS7 winning opposition political party leaders we have in Zambia. They're full of jokes. They promise citizens that each and every citizen who's in business will be given an excavator machine. Where on earth? As for, Hichilema, he has done a lot in 5 years. Falanga says, HH is winning. Do you think that all those civil servants he employed can vote for the opposition? Those parents getting social cash transfers can vote for Mundubile. Now, those parents whose children are on free education, can they vote for Mundubile? Do you think me, who's enjoying peace in this country, can vote for Mundubile? My vote is for HH rather. In fact, salty sana. Falanga there, thank you for your comments as well. Currency also sharing a thought. If you must know, millions of Zambians have moved on. Edgar Lungu no longer exists in their minds. We only have one president of all Zambia, Hakainde Hichilema. Wheeler says, Lungu's burial, it's a non-factor. HH definitely winning again. The dead body is with the family and the SA government. Life has moved on here. Well, we welcome your thoughts and we continue the conversation. Thank you for weighing in. Perhaps as we continue on the other side, just after the ad break, SABC News specialist correspondent Sophie Mukwena. She attended the Hichilema Motlanthe Foundation Winter Seminar. It was held in Sandton. This is where attendees shared their views on the implications of migration for Southern Africa and the African continent. All that and more, stay tuned. Welcome back. Unwrap Africa continues. Now, former President Hichilema says the issue of migration has implications for both South Africa and the continent as a whole. The sentiment, it was echoed at the Hichilema Foundation Winter Seminar held in Sandton, convened under the theme Continent and Migration. The seminar brought together political leaders, business executives, diplomats, academics, and international organizations, all to discuss migration from a continental perspective. Well, the SABC News specialist correspondent Sophie Mukwena found this report.
High cost to us.
The issue of migration has led to a challenging period for South Africa as countries push for Pretoria to answer at the African Union. This thorny issue received attention at the Hichilema Foundation event, which focused on African migration. The day was filled with discussions aimed at encouraging dialogue and developing a strategy to counter the challenges of migration. Former President Motlanthe says the talks can help foster long solutions.
Given the structure of our economy, it is therefore imperative for government to always strive to be in charge as it responds to the cries of the unemployed, the poor and marginalized sections of our nation. Failure to maintain authority on the part of government invites lawlessness and near anarchy with devastating consequences. And it is important for political leaders to know that they are not only responsible for the way they lead, but also for what is done by those they lead, particularly in times of crisis and upheavals.
The seminar comes after International Relations and Cooperation Minister Ronald Lamola travelled to Ghana as a special envoy to meet the President of Ghana in Accra, John Mahama.
The first key issue for the meeting was that this matter should not affect South Africa-Ghana bilateral relations that has been enduring, two very good friendly countries that are now engaged in this very robust engagement matter that is very necessary for the African continent to engage on the migration issue. So we have agreed with Ghana and President Mahama in particular that this matter will not impact South Africa-Ghana binational relations and that engagement in relations to the bilateral relations will continue. But the thorny issue of migration, they are insisting to take it through the processes of the AU. And as South Africa, we welcome it to be discussed at some stage at the highest level of the African Union because it will deal with the pull and push factors, the root causes of migration, which impacts all African countries. And as you are aware, South Africa being one of the highest receiving countries in the continent, number one, followed by Egypt and Ivory Coast. So this is an issue that will have to be discussed, issues of economic growth, job creation across the continent.
The former South African Deputy Finance Minister also weighed in.
Over the past few months, South Africans have witnessed scenes that would trouble the conscience of any nation. Vigilante groups have hunted down immigrants at their homes in the streets. Spaza shops have been looted and burned. Families who came here seeking opportunity and safety have been headed into makeshift encampments, while African governments have had to hire buses and charter special flights to evacuate their citizens from the country they once considered a beacon of hope. Men and women who share our continent, our history, and in many cases our struggle for freedom have been made to feel like strangers, intruders, and outcasts. They have been told that they do not belong. Those who are behind the protest say that unchecked immigration has brought more people into our country than we can cope with. That they have taken our jobs and our houses and brought crime to our neighborhoods. We are told that we do not have the space or resources to offer refuge to people fleeing the failures of their own governments and societies. By contrast, many Africans see what is happening as primarily a human rights matter, in which their fellow citizens, undocumented or not, are being dehumanized and mistreated. What is abundantly clear is that there is no easy answer, no simplistic solutions to what is an economic, a moral, and political challenge, one that touches on people's fears and their deepest sense of identity and belonging. South Africa is not alone in dealing with these challenges. Across the world, societies are wrestling with who belongs, how newcomers can be accommodated, and how nations can reconcile compassion with social cohesion.
Sophie Mukwena, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Welcome back. Uganda obviously now also stepping up emergency funding as a prolonged dry spell threatens crops, livestock, food supplies across parts of the country. Authorities have set up aside around $13.5 million US. That's to help vulnerable communities as East Africa faces increasingly unpredictable weather, all linked to climate change. Michael Baleke reports.
For livestock farmer James Twahira, keeping his cattle fed has become a daily challenge. With grazing land drying up after months of little rain, he now relies on grass collected from the bush and processed into silage to feed the herd. He says changing weather is making farming more uncertain and more expensive.
Back then, we had plenty of grazing land. Animals from different owners shared the same grazing areas and water sources, but now, with a growing population, most of that land is privately owned, so the animals are confined to smaller areas. When drought comes, we have to buy the feed and sink our own wells for water, which is very expensive.
James's experience is becoming increasingly common across Uganda. Agriculture employs most of the country's workforce, leaving millions vulnerable when the rains fail. These fields would normally be covered in green pastures. Instead, the land is dry and grass is sparse, and farmers are struggling to find enough feed and water for their animals. It's a challenge that is threatening livelihoods here in Uganda and raising broader concerns about food security across the region. The impact is being felt most severely in Karamoja in northeastern Uganda, where repeated droughts have deepened food insecurity. The government says at least 19 people have died from hunger in Karamoja in recent weeks, underscoring the growing humanitarian toll of the drought. Emergency distribution is now underway with new funding supporting food relief, water access, and other measures to protect the hardest hit communities.
We want to save the lives of those people who are still there, because it is really in a very dire state to have this kind of thing. Because we didn't expect this. I don't think anybody was ready for this. The drought came surprisingly, but people had cultivated.
Relief officials say the response is aimed at helping vulnerable families now, while also strengthening the country's ability to cope with future climate shocks.
There's money, so we're going to build more dams, we're going to build more silos in Karamoja or in Kampala, where it is going to be like a granary for food.
Climate experts warn that droughts are becoming more frequent across East Africa, making adaptation just as important as emergency relief. For farmers like James, the hope is not only for rain, but for long-term solutions that can help them withstand a changing climate. Michael Baleke, SABC News, Luweero, Central Uganda.
Well, that's us here from Unwrap Africa. I mean, the story of Africa continues to unfold every single day. Keep exploring and keep telling those stories. From myself, Hazel, and the team. Until next time, take care. It is goodbye for now from all of us.